Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you the complete start to finish build of this small 1x5 foot N scale switching layout. This layout was built into a wooden case that you can close up, latch shut. It has a drawer for storing your locomotive, all your rolling stock, the power supplies, the controllers. Everything is self-contained in this little portable N scale layout. So definitely a great layout for someone who doesn't have the space for a permanent setup. You can take it out, open it up, set everything up, have a fun operating session, and then put it all away back up on the shelf or in the closet or wherever you need, and you don't take up any permanent space in your house. So overall, this was a really fun project. I built it over the course of a couple years, just kind of going back and forth to it periodically as I had time between other projects, but it's finally been completed. So anyway, this is the whole complete story of how I built this small 1x5 foot N scale switching layout. I've compiled all the videos in the entire series of building this layout, kind of stripping out the intros and outros and a few parts here and there to condense it a little bit more. And so it's a little bit easier to watch than watching all of the individual parts in this series. But anyway, hope you enjoy the construction process of this small N scale layout. First off, here's a quick look at the pieces I needed to build the layout. I did use a 5 foot long piece of 1x2 pine that isn't pictured here, and I also didn't use all the hardware shown at the bottom, but did end up using a couple of handles that aren't shown that I already had left over from other projects. I also used a pneumatic door stay to help keep the lid of the case open during operating sessions. All of the clear pine I purchased was in 6 foot and 8 foot long lengths, so the first step was measuring and cutting all the required pieces to length. While I do have a chop saw, I cut everything using a handheld circular saw and a speed square. By holding the speed square tight against the edge of the board and using it as a guide, you can still get nice square cuts even when cutting by hand. Here is the same picture I showed earlier, but with notes on where each of the pieces were used and also notes on the length and width of the pieces. Note that the exact measurements will depend on the width and thickness of your particular lumber. That top lid and main layout base were 12-inch pine, which means they were really just over 11 inches in actual width. In retrospect, it might have been better to use 3/4 inch birch plywood for the lid top and layout base in order to make it a full 12 inches wide. The top lid was a full 5 feet or 60 inches long, while the main layout base was 1.5 inches shorter to account for the thickness of the side pieces. My office desk is 60 inches long, and so I wanted this layout to fit on the desk if I decide to operate the layout in my office. The back of the layout is a piece of 1x8 inch pine, while the front is composed of 2 pieces of 1x4 inch pine, plus a 1x2 pine board that isn't shown, but is used to fill the remaining gap and also acts as a handle to lift the lid. The short 11¼ inch pieces of wood used on the underside of the layout are all made from 1x3 inch pine boards. I assembled the layout case with glue and screws, and I favor GRK fasteners or similar since it is nearly impossible to strip the head on them. I clamped some of the 1x3 pine boards to the back of the layout to help line up where I wanted the layout base to be attached, and the layout base board was then glued and screwed to the layout back. Next, I shifted the 1x3 boards to help prop up the layout side so I could glue and screw those in place as well. I also glued and screwed in a piece of 1x3 on the inside bottom of the layout on each edge to help support the bottom of the base and provide a thicker side on the bottom to which I could later attach adjustable feet and not have to worry about them sticking out beyond the edge of the layout. My wood was warped in various directions, so this extra board also helped to securely attach the main layout base to the board and keep it straight. I got the other side attached and then started marking out where I wanted the front boards to go and where I wanted the drawer to be situated. Once I figured out where I wanted the drawer to be located, I could attach more support pieces on the bottom of the layout, and those not only helped to stiffen and flatten the layout base, but it also would serve as places to secure the drawer slides later on during the construction. I then cut the front trim piece where I wanted the drawer to be, and ending up with 3 sections, the left and right sides, plus the actual drawer front itself. When working on the layout top, I hadn't noticed the camera had fallen forward and was pointing at the floor, and so I wasn't able to video the assembly of the lid. But it is just a 1x4 piece of pine attached to one edge of a 60-inch long piece of 1x12 pine, and a 1x2 inch pine board then attached at a 90-degree angle to the bottom of that 1x4. I attached the lid to the layout case using a 40-inch long piano hinge, roughly centered on the back of the layout. And this piano hinge was attached with a couple dozen screws, so it does make for a pretty secure connection. I did need a way to keep the lid open since it was front heavy and would tend to fall shut. And I tried using different locking mechanisms, but all of them failed, and this really wouldn't help to keep the lid open the way I wanted. So I jumped on Amazon and ordered a couple different door lift stays to help hold the lid open, as well as some toggle latches to help hold the lid closed during storage and transport. While I waited for those to arrive, I worked on the front of the layout case. I glued and nailed the front trim of the layout in place on either side of the drawer opening, and then I worked on attaching the drawer slides. The drawer slides I used are 12 inches long and were the shortest I found at Home Depot. Since the layout baseboard is only 11¼ inches wide, I needed to cut notches in the back of the layout to accommodate the back end of the drawer slides. The 1x8 on the back is 3/4 inches thick, and so the combination of the back panel plus the actual layout board itself does make for a 12-inch deep case and the needed 12-inch length to fit the drawer slides. I used my circular saw to cut the notches to the right depth and then finished knocking them out with a chisel. I used a couple of clamps to hold each drawer slide in place while I screwed them to keep them level and in the orientation I needed. Next, I built the drawer box out of 2 pieces of 1x3 and 2 pieces of 1x2 pine. I had already cut out those 1x3 pieces earlier on, and so I just needed to cut the 1x2 pieces for the front and back of the drawer long enough to make sure the drawer would be wide enough to fit in between the drawer slides, but not so wide that it would be a tight fit, making the drawer hard to open. I also screwed the inner side of the drawer slide to the sides of the drawer box and then attached the front trim piece to the front end of the drawer with a few screws. While I still needed to add a bottom to the drawer, the Amazon Prime truck showed up with my door stays, and so I decided to work on those next. The pneumatic ones looked to clearly be a better choice since the folding arm version I also picked up would take up too much space on the side of the layout in the closed position. They fold down as you close the lid, and so I wouldn't be able to put anything on the sides of the layout near them because they would basically crush anything as the lid came down. The pneumatic stays don't drop any lower where you attach them when they are in the closed position, so you don't have to worry about them eventually damaging any scenery. Also, the stays I picked up can hold a lot of weight, and I only needed to use one of them to help keep the lid open. The instructions tell you where you need to install the brackets that hold the pneumatic piston arm, and those just attach with a few screws each, and then you can just snap on the piston arm itself and you are good to go. I'll definitely use these on future projects as well, since I do have some extras. At this point, it was time to sand the layout case smooth and get it ready for staining. I sanded the layout with a coarse and then a fine grit sanding disc, and then went back and filled in all the nail and screw holes with some wood putty. While I was waiting for that wood putty to dry, I worked on making the bottom of the drawer. I cut a piece of cardboard down until it was the right fit to fit the bottom of the drawer, and then I used that as a template to cut out a piece of 1/8 inch plywood. Once that was cut to size and sanded a bit, it was ready to attach with a few screws. I sanded the bottom of the drawer and then went back and sanded the rest of the layout again to smooth out all the spots where I had used the wood putty. After wiping all the dust off the layout, it was time to apply a nice cherry stain. I stained the inside and outside of the layout case, but if you are going to add scenery right away, you don't really need to stain the inside. But doing the inside does give a nice finished look, and it makes it more enjoyable to use before structures and scenery are later added. After staining, I attached the toggle latches on each side of the lid and then attached a handle onto the front of the drawer. The handle isn't really needed, but I liked the look of it, and so I went ahead and added it. Finally, I attached a carry handle to the front of the lid to use when transporting the layout, and it also acts as a nice handle to use when opening the lid. I put the handle in the middle, but the layout isn't actually quite balanced since the side with the drawer is heavier, and so that does make it a little bit awkward to carry, but it isn't too bad. Anyway, here you can see the mostly finished case. I'll still need to put on a few coats of polyurethane on the case, but I'll wait until after the layout project is pretty much done before I go ahead and do that in case I have to touch up the stain or wood in different areas. So for this layout, I'm using an NCE power cab to control things, and I think it makes a nice choice for a layout like this if you want to go DCC. In the basic package, you get the hand controller, a panel you can mount on your layout fascia that you can plug everything into, the AC power supply unit, and a plug with screw terminals to which you can connect the wires from the track on your layout. Cables to connect your hand controller to the layout panel are of course also included. The power cab is a little different from other DCC hand controllers in that the power cab hand controller also serves as a DCC base station and contains all of the electronics. Thus, it is a larger unit than the basic hand controllers you might have in a Digitrax or other system. But it is still comfortable to hold and use, and overall, this is really a great system for smaller layouts. To mount the panel to the front of the layout, I drilled a few holes and then chiseled out the opening to the correct size I needed to actually fit the panel in place. And curiously, the box didn't come with any screws to attach the panel to the layout, but I had plenty of small screws that would work fine, so it really wasn't an issue for me. I didn't want to plug the power supply directly into the back of the panel though, since that would be kind of awkward to do if the layout was sitting on a table, as you would have to tip it up to reach and access the plug, and then the layout might crush the power cable when it was actually put back down. But luckily I had another plug of the same size as the one on the power cab panel, and so I soldered on some wires to the terminals on the power port of that panel, and then I ran those to the back corner of the layout where I could put the other power plug port. I drilled a hole through the back corner of the layout case, chiseled it out large enough to fit the kind of odd shape of the plug itself, and then fed the wires through that I had soldered onto the main panel. Then I soldered those wires onto the extra power port plug, added some hot glue to the hole to hold the plug in place, pushed the power port in, and then filled in the little gaps around the edges with some wood putty. Finally, it was time to install the track on the layout. I picked up a load of Kato Unitrack for the project, unpacked the track, and assembled it per my track plan, which you can see here as well. I'll have a listing of the track used in the video description as well as in the blog post that accompanies this video. Once I had the track laid out, I needed to drill holes for the turnout wires as well as the power leads for the track. I added power connectors on the ends of each track as well as between the turnouts in the middle to hopefully prevent any dead areas on the layout. The Kato turnouts are power routing, so it might be possible to just have two sets of power leads in the middle of the layout and power everything that way, but I would rather not have to rely on the turnouts to supply power to each track. I marked the location of each hole, drilled the holes, cleaned up the mess, and then replaced the track on the layout. I fed the wires through the holes and then removed the rail joiners where I wanted to attach the wire unit joiners. I did eventually have to solder on a pair of wires directly to the rail itself on the end of one track section because I accidentally pulled off the wires from one of the sets of wired unit joiners. And of course it's a lot cheaper to just solder all the wires in place and not use unit joiners at all, but the wired unit joiners are fast and convenient to use as long as you don't break them. Now I had the bad idea to attach the track by putting hot glue in all the holes where I fed the wires through, and that would help to hold down the track. The idea was that I could put the glue in each hole and then hold the wires taut to keep the track flush against the wood. Now that would have worked really well had I done that long enough to let the glue fully dry, but unfortunately in a few spots I found the track had pulled away before the glue had fully set, and that created a few little raised areas that caused the cars to uncouple during testing. And so the solution was to scrape away as much glue as I could in those areas and then squirt some more hot glue under the track in the raised areas. The new hot glue melted the old hot glue, and then I could just press down on the track in that area until the glue was set again, and that flattened and secured the raised areas that were causing those problems. While I connected two sets of wires to the DCC system for initial testing, I still needed to go through and redo all the wiring for long-term use. And remote turnout operation isn't really needed on a layout this small when your hand is really never more than about a foot away from any turnout during an operating session, but I went ahead and added remote control push buttons anyway. Since the Kato turnouts have those built-in switch motors, it kind of felt like a waste to not use them, so I picked up two of the Digitrax DS74 units and more of the push buttons I used on my previous 3.5 by 5.5 foot N scale layout project to control those turnouts. Now you might think that you can't use Digitrax DS74 units with an NCE power cab, but you can, and I found that I've had no issues whatsoever using them together, at least in this application. These DS74 units work like the DS64 units that I had used in the past, except that they now have a pin connector to which you attach a ribbon cable instead of additional screw terminals for those wires. There is a set of terminals to connect the DCC power to, 4 sets of terminals to connect the switch machine motors to, a common power wire that supplies power to your push buttons or whatever other controllers you're using, and then the ribbon cable connector to which you can attach the other push button wires, sensors, or whatever else you plan to attach to these units. First off, I needed to drill 6 holes for the push button controllers, and so I marked out the spots for the buttons so they were evenly spaced. I drilled a set of small pilot holes, and then I used a step bit to bore out the holes to the needed 3/4 inch diameter. The step bit is actually designed to be used on sheet metal, but that makes it produce a really nice smooth hole in wood, as you can see here. And a regular 3/4 inch wood drill bit would make a much more ragged hole, but you could still use one if you're careful enough. I then pulled a bunch of wires to connect to the buttons, and I tried to select wire colors that generally match those on the ribbon cable that connects to the DS74 unit, so it'd be pretty much the same wire color from the connector all the way to the button, making it easier to track down any future wiring problems. First though, I connected the common power wire to the buttons, simply daisy chaining them all together instead of connecting 6 individual separate wires. I then connected a second wire from each push button to the appropriate spot on the ribbon cable on either of the 2 DS74 units. The DS74 instructions show you which color wire on the ribbon cable connects to which switch machine terminal. The diagram here shows how I wired everything together, and I connected 4 turnouts to one DS74 unit and then 2 turnouts to the other, since each can only handle 4 turnouts. But note that the common power wire going to the buttons was actually just from one single DS74 unit. It doesn't really matter which unit the buttons are wired to. For the common wire, only the second wire matters, as that is the one that actually determines which turnout the button will operate. The cool thing about these units is that you only need to use one button for each turnout. Each button press will throw the turnout in the opposite direction from which it is currently oriented. I tested all the buttons to make sure I heard a turnout operating with each push, and one thing I quickly learned though was that since these are solenoid type switch machines, the DS74 unit wouldn't be able to power them if you hit the buttons in rapid succession. Sometimes it would take a second or two for the turnout to actually throw, since the capacitors in the DS74 unit needed to recharge before being able to send enough current to operate the turnout. And that's only an issue if you push a bunch of buttons one after the other. During normal use where you're just doing one at a time, it's not an issue. With everything working correctly, I soldered all the wire connections and then used some heat shrink tubing to cover the connections or just wrap them in electrical tape. I didn't have enough of the heat shrink tubing of the right size that I needed, and my liquid electrical tape had pretty much hardened up on me, so I had to resort to electrical tape at this point in time to cover all the connections. And I'll probably go back and redo a lot of those with either heat shrink tubing or just get more of that liquid electrical tape and paint that on all the connections at a later time. And once the wiring was complete, it was time to add some panels to cover the bottom of the layout. And so I cut a bunch of small sections of 1x2 pine to help support those bottom panels and to provide a place to screw the panel into. I attached each of the wood blocks with glue and a couple of wood screws, and then I just screwed on the bottom panels. I of course didn't use any glue on those panels since I'll have to eventually remove those anytime I need to access the wiring. And so once the panels were in place, I stained them with the same cherry stain I used on the rest of the layout. Next, it was time to finish up the drawer. I cut 2 pieces of foam to the size I needed that I actually stole out of one of my Pelican cases that I currently use for carrying astronomy gear. One is a thin piece that goes on the bottom, and the other is a thicker piece that will be cut to hold the controller and the rolling stock. With both pieces of foam in the drawer, I played with different arrangements for all the items, and it was at this point that I wish I had really made the drawer a few inches wider so I'll be able to hold more pieces of rolling stock. And once I decided on the placement, I traced around each object with a knife to score the foam, and then cut through the foam with the knife after pulling it out of the drawer so I didn't cut through that bottom layer of foam. And that whole process is a bit tedious, so after cutting a few of the openings, I worked on adding a piece of cove molding to the back of the layout case to cover up the exposed wires there. And this is basically just a square piece of pine with one corner cut off, and so I just glued the strip of molding in place and then tacked it in with a few finish nails to hold it while the glue dried. I covered the nail holes with a bit of wood putty, and then while waiting for that to dry, I worked on adding some adjustable feet to the bottom of the layout. Those little adjustable feet have a threaded plastic insert that is pressed into the hole that you have to drill for each one of them, and then the feet screw into those plastic inserts. This way you can adjust the height of each foot by either just screwing it in farther or unscrewing it a little bit, and that can help you keep the layout nice and level so your rolling stock isn't going one way or another on the layout if you have it on an uneven surface. And finally, I stained the strip of wood on the inside of the layout case and finished cutting out the foam in the drawer to hold everything, and the layout was pretty much ready to use. areas. Okay, so I started out by cutting sections of 1/4-inch foam core board to fit all the areas that I wanted to have either roadway or structure bases. And then once that was done, I laid out various pieces of metal brackets, straps, washers, and so forth in all the areas where I wanted to be able to magnetically attach buildings. And then I just traced around those with a knife, cutting out those sections of foam core board. And then I glued in strips of styrene to help build up the areas where I was going to have each of the brackets. So the top of the bracket would be pretty much even with the top of the foam core board. I glued all the brackets in with more tacky glue and then just continued working my way around the layout until I had all the various sections filled in with the brackets. And so you can see here what that looked like with all the metal brackets embedded within the foam core board. In order to cover all that up and to provide a finished roadway type surface, I went ahead and covered all of those areas with pieces of sheet styrene, cutting everything to pretty much match the same size as the foam core board. And then I also built a grade crossing across the track. I used more tacky glue to glue down the styrene. And then I glued a couple of neodymium magnets to one of my structure pieces, and then filled in one of my other structures with spray foam so it would be a little bit more durable when I was picking it up and moving it around the layout. And then once the foam was dry, I cut it even with the base of the structure and glued in 4 magnets so it would have plenty of areas to attach to various pieces of metal embedded in the actual layout base. Next, it was time to spray paint all the layout bases, and so I covered all the track areas with masking tape. And then before I actually painted everything, I went ahead and took a knife and scored in expansion joints across all of those concrete base and roadway areas. I just used a metal ruler as a guide and also as a way to evenly space all of the lines. And then I just worked my way across the layout using the rule to make evenly spaced score marks across all of those roadway and base areas. Once that was done, I took a sanding block and lightly sanded all of the concrete base areas to help remove any little raised edges where I made the score marks and to also provide a little bit better tooth for the paint to adhere when I spray painted it. And then I took 3 different colors of spray paint, 1 tan and a couple gray colors, and just sprayed everything down to provide a nice concrete base color for the entire layout. There's still plenty of weathering to do here, and so that has to be done still, but I'll go ahead and do that once I have more of the scenery work done around the roadway areas so I don't end up having to redo and touch up those areas on the roadways. But here you can see what all the concrete areas look like. Here are one structure in a couple different parts that I have partially built. There's still details to add and weathering and stuff to do, but I did build a sample structure to kind of show how they can be rearranged on the layout. So both of these structure segments have magnets in the bases, which are of course covered up at this point. But with the metal that's embedded underneath the concrete areas, that does allow them to kind of snap into place. And it stays, you can slide them around, but it does stay pretty strong. And to give you an idea of how strong that bond is, I'll just go ahead and try to shake them off. And you can see that for the most part, they're not going to move much and stay pretty much right where you put them. So you can close the lid, carry it around, and those structures will stay where they're at. And so say I don't want to have this structure here, I can remove it, stick it here on this side, and it's going to stay pretty strong right there. And this way I can kind of customize things within a range of what'll fit in this sort of environment. And that will allow me to have different types of operating sessions. So I might have some silos for plastic pellets, or maybe a food processing plant, or it might just be regular warehouses, or I could just have one area open as a team track on another operating session. So overall, that's kind of the idea here. The current thinking is I will just change out the ones in the front. So I'll have 4 spots, essentially 2 on the left and 2 on the right, that I can swap out for different industries. So that will give me some flexibility, because in most of the time, I figure I'll just want to change out one industry anyway, depending on what I'm trying to do here for an operating session. But anyway, if you are looking at doing a portable switching layout, you want to have a lot of flexibility in your operating session, consider having structures that are easily removable. It doesn't have to be magnets. It could be some wooden dowels that are on the bottom of every structure platform, and maybe you have a couple spots where you can plug them into in the layout and do things that way. Or you can just have them sitting there without any attachment method at all, but just have them unattached to the layout, so you can easily pick them up and move them off the layout and store them, and then just select which structures you want to have on for each individual operating session. So a while back, Apollo Controllers did send me a couple of their DC panel mounted controllers, and these are really nice. You can see the front is very pretty looking. You have your power button, and then you simply have forward and reverse control with the throttle control here. And the back is a very nice, elegant looking circuit board. So everything is just really well done on these controllers. And I didn't think I was going to have a project for them for a while, but then I bought the locomotives and I was like, well, I might as well add DC control to this small switching layout, because that does give me a way to run some DC locomotives as well. Now, obviously, I already have a DCC system on there, so all I'm going to do is simply take one of these toggle switches and this controller, and I'll just be able to switch back and forth. So the operation here is pretty simple. All I'm going to do is take the output from the DC controller, put it to one side of this double pole, double throw toggle switch, take the output from the DCC system, attach it to the other side of a double pole, double throw switch, and then the terminals in the middle will go to the track. And so depending on which way you throw the switch, it'll either connect the DC or the DCC power output to the track itself. So all I really need to do is cut out two openings on the front of the 1x5 foot layout, one for the toggle switch, which does have a faceplate too to cover up the opening as well, so you don't have to be that precise. And for the controller, all I need to do is make sure I have enough opening space to make sure none of the components are being crushed up against the wood of the front of the layout. But overall, it should be a pretty straightforward and simple installation, so let's get started. So the first step in this process was to unscrew two of the bottom panels on the 1x5 foot layout so I could access all of the wiring. Once that was done, I marked out the space I needed to cut out for the Apollo DC controller, just using a scrap piece of cardboard material here to make a relatively square opening. The panel of the Apollo controller is going to be a lot larger than the opening you need to cut out, so you don't need to be that precise with the opening, just making sure it's large enough so you do have enough space for all of the electronic components to fit inside of it. To cut out the opening, I just drilled a hole in each of the four corners of the area I needed to cut out, and then used my jigsaw to cut out the full opening. Next, I did the same thing for my toggle switch. This toggle switch does come with a plastic panel that does cover up the opening itself. So again, you don't have to be that precise with the actual opening, just making sure it's large enough for the toggle switch to fit inside of. I test fit the toggle switch and the controller, and things look good there. I then went ahead and wired everything up, and I'll just kind of talk through how I did the wiring here in a minute. But finally, all I had to do was screw the panels on the bottom of the layout, and things were ready to operate. Okay, so let me explain the wiring that I did here. This is the back of the Apollo controller, and obviously I have two of them. And this is the back of a double pole, double throw switch here. So you can see how everything was set up and how the wiring is going to work. I have two power supplies now. The one on the bottom is for the DCC system, and the one up here is for the DC controller, which takes anything between 5 and 12 volts. The DC power goes into the controller here, and that goes into the plug on the back right here. The DCC power goes to the back of the DCC panel here. All I really had to do for this setup to work was to take the track output from the DC controller and run it to one side of the double pole, double throw switch here, and then I ran the DCC output wires to the other side of the double pole, double throw switch here, and then wires from the two middle terminals were run to the track power wires in the middle of this mess down here. And so when I flip the toggle switch, it will either send the DCC power to the track, or when in this direction, the DC power will be sent to the track. So you can have both of these systems on, but which one sends power to the track is determined by this toggle switch. And so don't be scared by this rat's nest of wires here. It's a pretty simple process. I just have all these wires because I have 8 sets of feeder wires going to the track, and then I have all the wires going to each of the turnouts for remote operation. But in terms of the double DC and DCC controls, it's a very straightforward process. So anyway, I'll get the bottom panels put back on here, and then we will be ready to operate. Okay, I have the power supply hooked up again. Then we will turn the power on, and once the red light stops flashing, we are ready to operate. Now I hooked up the power so that when I turn the throttle knob to the left, the train goes to the left, and when I turn the knob to the right, the train goes to the right. If the train direction is opposite of what you want with this controller, just flip the two wires on the terminals on the back of the controller. I will also note that the controller has a click stop at the center off position, so you know when you are at that position and you aren't guessing where the off position is, which is quite obvious. You can smoothly decrease the speed in one direction, reach the click stop, and then smoothly increase the speed in the other direction. You can see that this controller provides very smooth control, and that these Atlas GP40-2s are also very smooth operators as well. For one of the structures on the layout, I mocked everything up with some foam and some doors I had glued on there. And so I decided I'm going to go ahead and build this structure using these DPM modular wall systems. So I have just a whole mess of parts. They're all different sizes, types. And I'm going to go ahead, take all this, dump it out, put it in a bin, and see what I can make that's about the size of this with all these parts. Okay, before I can assemble everything, I need to go through and just nip off all these nubs. So now I can kind of play with how this might look. And these DPM wall panels are always basically two panels together, and so you can easily cut them in half to make an even more custom arrangement of wall sections. Anyway, it's just a lot of playing around to figure out how you want to get things arranged with all these pieces to make up your own custom structure. Actually, what I think I'm going to do here next then is just go through and tape everything together with a bunch of painter's tape so it's not permanent, and I can put it on the layout and then arrange things how I want. Okay, so I think I have an arrangement that I like here, a pretty large structure that will span the entire left half of the layout, and this will pretty much be all of the structure for this side of the layout. Okay, so assembling these panels is quite straightforward. I've already done a few here. I did this corner part just to get that one started, but essentially, let me get the tape off. It's just going to be a matter of gluing these together. I like to use something like bonding for styrene like this, so you can kind of melt it together and you get a really strong bond that way. But you could use another plastic adhesive as well. The first thing obviously is to clean up all the edges of these pieces. When I cut these panels apart, I did it kind of roughly, so there is a little bit more sanding to do. If I had done the cutting a little bit neater, I could have avoided more of the sanding, but it sands very quickly. I'm also going to need these pieces here. So yeah, okay, so I have two sets. So I can then glue this piece to this panel section here. But first I'll glue these together here, apply the solvent to one side. Just make sure the bricks are lined up. And these joiner pieces are nice because you can make a really rough cut, and then once you put in the brick columns, everything will be hidden and it'll secure the pieces better and you won't see the joints. It also helps with the spacing. What I've been doing as well is just taking some scrap styrene and just sort of using that as a way to not only brace the back a little bit, but really just help lock everything together. It won't matter so much once the building is fully assembled, but at least while you're doing this initial assembly, it helps to have some additional support. I can come and try to add this to the next section here. So anyway, it's just a matter now of completing all the additional sections. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going and doing these additional wall panels. And they do give you some styrene pieces for the roofs of the structures, but they're all fairly small, and so I just went ahead and used larger pieces of chipboard for the roofs of both of these structures, so I didn't have a whole bunch of seams I had to glue together. And to brace the roof structure, I took small strips of styrene and glued those around the top of each of the walls, and so that made for a better surface for connecting the rooftops. Okay, so I have the roofs glued on. Everything is pretty much ready here. All I want to do next now is add in some modeling putty. Got this Vallejo as well as this testers. Basically go through, fill in all the little gaps, let that dry overnight, and I'll come back tomorrow and paint. I'm not trying to make an award-winning model here. I'm just trying to, just do enough to make it look better. So any obvious big gaps get filled in, and it just looks a little bit more realistic and respectable. Sometimes real small gaps you can just fill in with the paint itself, but a lot of these are just too big. I like this Vallejo putty a lot, just mainly because it has this hole in the side apparently, but the smaller nozzle, which makes it a little bit easier just to apply it where you want it. Oh, a random note here is that these loading doors you get with those Walters warehouse kits are a perfect fit, and so I'm going to be using these instead of the ones that come with these modular panels. Alright, this is kind of a mess, but we'll see how that looks tomorrow after I do some sanding on it, and perhaps it will be good enough. Once the putty had dried and I had done some sanding, I sprayed everything with a gray primer. Okay, so I did this part of the whole structure. This is the part that'll, be more of a physical, three-dimensional type structure. And I kind of played around with this to get a look that I was at least relatively happy with. So again, I spray painted everything with this gray color as a base. So it's basically kind of like a primer, and it also serves as the mortar color for this structure. And then I use Calvary Brown for the actual brick color. Obviously, you have two options. You can do it this way, or you can do everything with your brick color and then come back and do your mortar on top of that. And that works well in general too, but I didn't want to have to brush paint everything because I didn't have any of the rattle can brick color that I normally use left. And I didn't want to pull out my airbrush, so I just went ahead and did it this way and kind of did a heavy dry brushing to get the brick color on there. And it didn't look quite as good as I wanted, so what I did was I took these pan pastels. This is extra suave. It's basically a gray pan pastel. And I just brushed that on everywhere as well to kind of blend things together better. And I think that overall made the brick look a little bit better than it did. But overall, that's how I'm going to do things. So I'm going to go ahead and do this bigger backdrop structure piece and do it the same way. And we'll see what it all looks like when it's done. Nothing really complex about this. But the goal is to where you can still have the mortar showing through in spots. But the nice thing about these modular panels is that all the windows are separately applied, which makes life a lot easier. Alright, now I'm going to take some of these weathering chalks and just kind of grind that in there good. I tried to grind that weathering powder in as good as I could, so I had a lot of the brick color exposed, but in a few areas there was just too much of it. And I did have to go back and do a little bit of light dry brushing of the brick color on top to bring out more of the brick detail. And you can obviously go back and forth and do it as much as you want until you're happy with the look. Right, so the next step is to glue all these windows in, and they do have a right side up side. One side has a slight curvature and the other side is flat. And so the slight curvature goes up. In some cases my little bracing is going to be interfering with the windows, so I'll have to trim some of that back. So windows and doors are all installed. Next we'll paint the roof. I'm actually going to go ahead and put a little bit of this same gray weathering powder on this roof. A little bit of black on there as well. Looks better. For the roof I'm doing gray, green, and a little bit of black. It's basically just a darker gray. And we'll see if I have a few details I can toss on. Alright, so once that paint dries, I'll come back and do some of the weathering powders on this part of the roof like I did with this one here. Next I have all the glazing to install. I'm going to use this clear tester's glue for windows and such. While they do give you glazing for all the windows, you do have to kind of cut them into pieces, and you can't just slap on a whole piece of glazing on each panel because they don't give you one sheet per panel. They just give you enough to cover all the windows. So once the glue dried on the windows, I went ahead and placed the two structures here on the layout so you can kind of get an idea of what they're going to look like. I'm not installing these structures just yet because I do need to work on the track itself in terms of weathering the rail and ties and starting work on ballasting and whatnot. And so I'm not going to go ahead and get these permanently installed just yet, but this way I can at least see how everything is going to look with these two structures here. And yes, there is clearance on that side, so I can in fact close the lid, and it does not hit any of these two structures. So that was obviously a consideration when I went ahead and built them, to make sure that everything would clear and this arm would be higher than the roof line of this structure here. Anyway. So these are the kits I decided to use for the remaining structures on the N-scale switching layout. I used the DPM Grips Luggage Manufacturing Company kit, the DPM Goodnight Mattress Company kit, the Walthers Modern Transload Terminal Kit, and the Walthers 2-stall 130-foot brick diesel house kit. I started off with the diesel house kit for the first structure, and I of course didn't build it as a diesel house as it was intended, but rather I use it as a background flat for the rear of the layout, and I picked this kit just because it had a long structure, and so I could make a pretty long background flat out of it. These are the wall panels you get with the kit. And I pretty much use all of them for this build. I wanted to join the two long sides together, but first I had to figure out how much to trim off the ends so that they would actually butt together and make a nice joint, since they were designed to be a corner, and so I wanted the pattern of the brick to match across both wall sections. So once I figured out how much to trim off one of the panels, I did that and sanded the cut edge flat and smooth, and then test fit the pieces. And then moved on to the very short ends of the structure, as it was only going to extend out about an inch from the back of the layout. I used the end piece that had the doors with it and basically just trimmed off the end on each side of that panel. And I also had a notch out the bottom to fit around the wood channel that's at the back of the layout that carries some wiring. I did the same for the other side piece and then worked on gluing everything together. I lined up the two long pieces with a ruler, applied some solvent, and then used a piece of scrap plastic to help strengthen that joint, applying more solvent to bond that piece in place to the other two wall pieces. I used more solvent to attach the two short ends to each side of the structure, and then set that all aside to dry. And then secretly off camera, I used the remaining wall sections to build this little extension to the structure off to the left-hand side. Once that was done, I used some plastic putty to fill in all the gaps between all the various wall panel sections, and then everything was ready to paint. So first I had to prep all the windows and door pieces before painting everything. Those are all separately applied with this kit. So I took a box lid and took a bunch of blue painter's tape and taped the painter's tape upside down, sticky side up to the lid. And that provided a nice sticky surface to hold all the pieces in place, but it's not so sticky that you can't get the pieces off after you finish painting them. So I arranged all the window and door pieces on the tape, including all the pieces I didn't actually need, because these Walthers kits like to reuse a lot of components from kit to kit. And so you get a lot of pieces that you don't actually need a lot of times for a given kit, but they're used in a similar kit and things like that. But I figured I might as well paint all the pieces at one time. This way I would just have them ready to go for another project at a later time, whenever I might need them. Now, despite all the extra window pieces, I was still somehow short one window. I don't know if I lost it or it just didn't come in the kit, but luckily the kit does come with these short brick panels that you can use to fill in two of the window bays halfway, and then use some smaller windows on top. So I ended up gluing those in place on the right two most window openings, so I could use the two small windows that came with the kit instead of the bigger windows for those places. Now for the paint colors, I used Rust-Oleum primer for the brick structure, since it does make a nice brick red color. And then I used a Rust-Oleum stone gray paint for all the windows and doors. I spray painted those off camera and then set them aside to dry overnight. The next day, I came back with an assortment of colors that were pretty similar to the brick color, but just a little bit different. So kind of all in that brown and dark red shade range of colors. I squeezed out just a little bit of each one on some cardboard, and then took a stiff brush and kind of randomly dabbled that paint on various places of the structure. And I tried to be as random as I could, and the idea was just to create some variation in the color of the brick across different parts of the structure wall. I came back with a large paintbrush to kind of help blend it in a little bit, and then went back and dabbed on additional paint here and there until I was happy with the overall look. And actually, it ended up being really subtle when everything dried. The paint color kind of blended in a lot more with the background brick color once everything had dried. And so you have to look really closely to see the variation in the paint color or the brick color on the structure, but it is there if you look closely. But when that had dried, I came back and worked on applying the mortar to the brick wall. And so to do that, I diluted some paint in water and then added a touch of plaster to help thicken it back up again. So basically what I wanted to do was really dilute the pigment, but then still have a similar thickness to the original paint. And so I painted that on the entire structure, trying to work it into all the various mortar joints and nooks and crannies. And I went back and forth a couple times trying to brush off all the excess, but also make sure I still had enough of that mixture in all of the joints. And when I was happy with how things looked, I set the wall aside to dry and worked on the windows and detail parts. I lightly brushed on some gunmetal gray on the various doors and roof vents, and then I also came back and took some burnt umber oil paint and lightly dry brushed all of the roof vents, the doors, and most of the windows with that to kind of make everything look lightly rusted. Later, when everything was dry, I came back with my pan pastel weathering powders and brushed those on the roof and walls of the structure. And the weathering powders not only dirty the structure up a little bit, but they also help to take off any remaining sheen of the paint. It was a flat paint to begin with, but there's always still a little bit more reflection than you would normally see in real life, and those powders really help to dim down any little last glisten you might see on the structure walls. So finally, it was time to glue on the window frames, and I cemented those in place without the clear glazing on them at this point, just using the regular plastic solvent that I use on the kit. And then I came back with some tester cement for clear parts and glued on all the included window glazing pieces. And I also came back and glued on the roof vents with some super glue. And then this structure was ready for the layout, and I think it turned out pretty nice. Next, I decided to work with the modern transload terminal kit. I got the parts I needed cut out, and then I worked on trying to figure out how I was going to use this kit on the front right corner of the layout, since I had kind of a small triangular spaced opening for that kit. And since it was going to be a smaller structure anyway, I decided to make it a little bit smaller than I originally planned on, and I cut the front wall right where one of the seams was in the plastic to make it a lot easier to cut. So I did that, and then I sized up the remainder of the structure based on that front wall panel, so the wall panel would basically come to an end right at the front edge of the layout. I took the long side of the kit that had no window openings and then cut that to size. And then I cemented those two pieces together using my 1-2-3 blocks to make sure I had a nice right angle. And since the structure is essentially cut off by the front of the layout, I decided I didn't really want to use the actual structure wall panels for that part, facing the front of the layout. And instead, I just cut a piece of the roofing material to size as that wall section and glued that to the first two pieces so I could basically make the completed structure. Now, I also had to cut off a piece of the structure base to fill in the gap on the bottom of the one long side that had the actual wall panel, because this kit is designed to sit on the foundation on the sides, and so if you don't put that little piece in there, the walls aren't going to be the same height. And so I didn't need the whole foundation piece, so I just cut off a narrow strip off one side of it and glued that to the bottom of that side, so everything would be even with the front of the structure. So next it was time to work on the actual roof. And so I used the remainder of the roof material for the actual structure roof. And I simply traced out the structure on the roof panel with a Sharpie and then cut it to size and cemented that in place with some additional scrap pieces of plastic on the inside to kind of hold and brace everything in place. And so here you can see how the structure is going to look on the front of the layout. Now, instead of painting and finishing this structure now, I decided to get the other two structures built and then paint all three of them at one time. So next I worked on the Grips Luggage DPM kit, and this was also going to be a kit bash to fit a space on the right side of the layout. So I played around with different arrangements of all the wall panels, sanding the panel edges as I needed, and kind of figured out how things would best fit together. And so once I had an arrangement that I liked, I started cementing the wall panels together. And the kit did come with one short section that worked out really well for the short side of the kit, so I left that unmodified for that side, and then I just cemented the various longer pieces together to make the two long walls. On the very right side of the wall facing the rear of the layout, I needed about 1 more inch of brick wall, and I could have cut the remaining wall section down to fit there, but I decided since you're not really going to see it easily anyway, I would just use some of the roof material and cut a piece for that little section there and glue that in place and save the whole wall panel for a different project so I wouldn't ruin anything trying to cut it to size. And so then I glued that little piece of roofing to the right side of the one wall and then got all the main wall sections cemented together with some additional bracing in the corners to make sure everything was nice and sturdy. The last part to do was a wall section that would go up against the side of the layout, and again, didn't need a wall section for that because you weren't going to see it. So again, I took some styrene from some of the roof material and made a wall section to fit up against the side of the layout and cemented that wall section in place, and then I basically took the entire structure, put it on a piece of chipboard and traced it out for the roof section. I didn't have any styrene sheets big enough for the roof of this resulting structure, so I just used a piece of chipboard, which is basically like a thick, dense cardboard. I traced out the roof size that I needed from the actual structure, cut that to size, and then cemented on pieces of square styrene strips around the top of the structure walls so I could have something to bond that roof to and have enough support for it. I glued down the roof with super glue since obviously the styrene solvent will not do anything in terms of bonding to the chipboard besides just make it wet, and so that worked pretty well to secure the roof in place. So once that was done, I set the structure aside to dry for a while. And so then later I came back and got out the plastic putty and filled in all the various gaps between the wall panels as well as between the roof and the wall sections. Then it was time to put that aside and work on the next structure. And for that one, I used the Good Night Mattress Company kit. And again, after trimming off all the excess plastic from the wall panels, I played around with how I wanted to actually build this kit. And I decided I really just wanted to build the tall central part of the structure and not the remaining single-story portion of the structure. So I cemented those 4 wall panels together, braced the corners with the extra styrene strips that were included, and then cut out a roof panel from the included styrene sheet to fit on top of the structure. Now here again, I decided to include this office portion that came from a different kit that I had built some time ago, since I thought it worked out pretty well with this model. And I don't remember which kit this actually came from, but it was a Walthers kit that had an office kind of sticking out of one side of a larger warehouse part. So these 4 additional structures are really going to help fill out the layout, but I do still plan to add 1 more non-rail served structure to the right of the central structure, just a little warehouse type kit to fill in this large empty space. Now for the smaller triangular structure in the front right corner of the layout, I decided to make the door operational since that would make it a little bit more entertaining during operating sessions. So for this door, all I did was take the included door that came with the kit, add on some additional styrene to the top of the door so it would extend up through the roof, and then cemented on another piece at a 90-degree angle along with some bracing, and then I glued on an HVAC unit to the top to use as a handle. And I made some simple channels on the inside of the structure along the door opening using some of the square styrene strips that came with the DPM kits and then some scrap pieces of styrene that came with the roof panels. I cut a slot along the top edge of the roof as well for the door to pass through, and so now I have a simple operating door that can easily be opened and closed during operating sessions. So the last steps for these structures were to add some diluted paint for the mortar joints, paint all the windows and doors and detail parts, and get all those attached and put in place. So again, I mixed up some diluted gray paint to use for a mortar mixture for all the structures that had brick areas. Next, I came back with my weathering powders and brushed those onto the structures as well to both tone down any remaining sheen from the paint and to give the structures an overall dirtier look. At this point, I tackled painting all the windows on the DPM kits, and since the windows are molded into the structures, you have to paint them by hand with a small brush. And that is a somewhat tedious process, but it does get faster as you get better at it. And the easiest way I found to do this is to paint the window frames the same color that you use for the mortar on the bricks. This way, if you get any paint onto the bricks themselves, you can just rub that paint off with your finger, and you won't get the paint obviously off that gets in between the mortar joints, but if it's the same color as the mortar joints, you can't even tell that it's there, and it blends right in and looks fine. So overall, I think the windows came out really well. And again, if you follow that technique of keeping the window color the same as the mortar joint color, everything does go really smoothly. I also glued on some additional roof details, such as the vents and HVAC units that came with the Walthers kits, plus a few extra ones that I had previously 3D printed or had left over from other projects. And so the last step was then to glue on the window glazing. I painted some tester cement for clear parts with a brush onto the interior of all the wall sections, and then cut pieces of clear plastic sheeting to fit the inside of each of the walls, and then just press them in place. And I'll eventually come back with either some dark gray paint and paint the interior of those windows, or I'll just stick a view block of some type inside the structure so you can't look and see directly through the structure from one window and out another. And so before taking some final video of these structures on the layout, I decided I might as well go ahead and weather the roads at this time too. So I mixed up some brown, gray, and black weathering powders and brushed those on all the road areas and all the concrete pad areas, and then brushed some additional black powder along the center lines of the road areas and all the areas I thought would be normally more heavily traveled. And I might have overdone it a little bit, but I can always come back and lighten things up pretty easily since nothing is permanent with the weathering powders. Anyway, you can see how the layout looks with these structures in place, and again, they aren't permanently mounted yet because I have to take them all off so I can work on the track weathering and ballasting and that kind of thing, but I'll come back after that and get everything securely glued in place. But I am getting excited that this layout is nearly done, and in the next video in this series, we'll go through all the scenery work, track ballasting, and all of that, and get this project wrapped up. So no matter how many lights I have on here in the garage or wherever else I have this small N-scale layout, I never have quite enough lighting on it, and so I added some LED lights to the inside of the lid, so I have a lot more lighting. Let's take a look. So what I do is I used one of these rolls of stick-on LED lights. These I picked up off Amazon. They were like $40 for a 16-foot roll. And so that allowed me to do 3 rows of LED lighting on this layout. Now these have plugs on both sides, so you can daisy chain them together, plug in a 12-volt power supply, and everything works really well in that regard. But I didn't use these plugs, I just cut them off and attached wires to the LED strips directly that then go to the 12-volt power supply that is used to power the DC controller, since I already had that in there and I didn't want to have to use an extra power supply for the LED lights. So overall, I think it works really well, and let's take a look at how I got these installed. Okay, so these are the LED lights that I plan to use, and we'll look at these in a second. Incidentally, the last structure on the layout is going to be a combination of these 2 concrete warehouse kits from Late Night Hobbies. So I'm going to basically combine these into one larger structure, so this should work out pretty well, I think. But anyway, you'll see this in the next video in the series. Let's get these lights opened up. So this is what you get with these. These do take a 12-volt power supply, so I'll just plug that in here. And so you can daisy chain these together, which is nice. If you get more than one, you can just connect them. So very bright, and this should work out really well. Okay, so I have my multimeter, and this is a 12-volt power supply coming in, and it says, unplug this, it does say 12 volts here, but I just want to make sure that I can actually supply 12 volts directly here without any issues. So just volts directly to any of these terminals. The way this tape stuff works is that you can cut this at any of these joints right here, and then you could have parallel lines and just do some jumper wires and stuff like that, but you can cut this pretty much to any length that you need, stick it in place, and it'll work out for you. So now that we know it is in fact 12 volts going to, through this actual cable, you're not supplying 12 volts to each LED. They basically have these wired in series, so that's splitting up the voltage that way. I plan to wire this directly to the DC power supply coming in for the DC controller, so I'm not going to actually use these plugs, but these plugs will come in handy for something else. But then I can just run wires from these terminals down to the DC power supply. So what I'll just be doing is sticking on the LED light strips to the bottom of this area right here. This way it'll shine the light down on the layout. I cut off one of the cables on the end here, and then I'll just work on peeling and sticking this. Okay, so now I gotta wire things up, and so I've got a collection of little wires here. I have 2 short wires, and then 1 long black wire, and then 2 short red wires, and another long black wire. And I could have used a long red wire, but I wanted both of the wires coming from the LEDs to be black, just so they'd be less noticeable. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and tin all these wires, basically just add some solder to all of these wires, which will make it a lot easier to then attach them to the LED strips. All right, so all these wire connections have some solder on them. And so there's 3 strips of LEDs. So basically what I'm going to do is connect all the positive terminals of 3 together like this, and all the negative terminals, and try it out. Okay, I have those wires installed. So now I'm just going to take my AC adapter and just touch the wires here to make sure everything works. And it does. We have light. Now I'll just get a small hole drilled through the corner of the base. Okay, so I have the 2 wires from the LED lights coming through this hole back here, and then this is the power line coming from the 12-volt adapter that goes to the DC controller. And so I stripped each of those wires. One of the wires going from the LED is connected directly to it, and the other wire is connected to the single pole, single throw switch. It's just an on-off switch. And then the other wire from the on-off switch will then go to the other power wire here. So basically, if I have the switch on, the power goes all the way through to the LEDs, and if it's off, it doesn't. So I'll go ahead and get all this soldered up, and then we'll try it out. Now, the only issue here is I don't know which one is positive and which one is negative with these wires. So the lights did not go on in that configuration, so we'll swap them. And the lights turned on, so I can solder these wires as they are. I'll use a little bit of liquid electrical tape on here, insulate those joints. I'll probably come back and maybe wrap them in electrical tape as well. And now through the shabby hole, I'll get the toggle switch pushed through. So I'll turn the lights on and off, get all this vacuumed up. Anyway, now you can see what a difference these LED lights make once I turn them on. This lid isn't all the way open because this HO layout above it here is in the way, so I can't fully extend it, and so it's kind of shining the light backwards a little bit. But nonetheless, you can see that it does make a big difference. Let me go ahead and turn all the lights off here in the garage. So even with all the lights off in the garage, it does still light up the layout pretty nicely. So one of the things I had to do to finish up this layout was to get the last structure built and installed. And to do that, I used 2 kits from Late Night Hobbies that are a simple concrete warehouse kit, and I combined both of those into one larger structure. These kits that Joey made at Late Night Hobbies are laser cut kits, and they're really easy to construct. He did a great job on how he designed everything, so everything fits together very easily. All the inside parts of the windows are on one sheet for each side, so instead of installing one window at a time, you put the whole sheet in there and all the windows are installed at one time for that side of the structure. So everything is just really easy and quick to assemble. So the first part of the process was just getting all the various wall panels and everything cut out of their wooden sheets so they were ready to put together. I test fit everything to try to figure out exactly how I was going to arrange things. You do have two long sides of this kit, one that's all windows and one that has a door, so I wanted to make sure that I could rearrange these so I had a door panel on the left side and on the right side of these two kits when combined together, and that worked out just fine. Then I test fitted the roof to see how that was going to work out before I actually started doing all the gluing. He gives you great detailed instructions as well, and I decided to go ahead and assemble everything with regular wood glue, and so I just got some wood glue and a small brush and worked on painting all the various edges of the pieces and assembling them together. To install the roofs, I flipped the buildings upside down, and then I took a little sample test plate he gives you for playing around with coloring the actual wood pieces and use that as a little spacer. So when you have the structure flipped back upright again, the roof would be recessed by a little bit, an eighth of an inch or so, and look more realistic. So I put that spacer piece there and then placed the roof panel on the inside of the structure and then spread glue around the edges to get that glued in place. I added some waste to help hold everything in place while the glue dried, and then I worked on getting all the interior pieces of the windows and doors and whatnot set up for painting. So I just took some scrap cardboard, put some pieces of masking tape on upside down, and put all the various detail parts like the window sills and the window interiors and door interiors stuck to that masking tape so I could go ahead and paint it. I originally planned on spray painting all those parts, but I decided I would just go ahead, since there weren't that many, and just do everything with a brush. So I went ahead and painted everything at one time, including the exterior of the structure. I was trying to go for sort of a light beige concrete block color, and so I just mixed up several colors of paint to kind of get the color I was after, and then brush painted the exterior and the interior of the structure so I wouldn't have to worry about any warping issues. And I mixed up a slightly grayer color for the window sills themselves, and then did a darker gray for all the window interiors and door interiors. And then I mixed up an even lighter gray color for the rolling doors of the structure as well. And here you can kind of see what that looks like with those windows and door panels installed. The beige color of the structure was a little bit too dark when it dried, and so I came back and lightened up the overall color and painted on a lighter coat for the second coat of paint. Once all that was dry, I mixed up a very light gray color into a wash, basically just adding a lot of water to a little bit of paint, so I could use that as the mortar color. I just brushed on the mortar color around the entire perimeter of the building, and then try to wipe off the excess using the brush as well as some of the paper instructions to get all the various big globs of pooled paint off along the bottom edges and so forth, so I'd have a pretty light, even coating of that gray. So one of the last things to paint was the edges of the door frames, and so I just took a mixture of gunmetal and dark gray paint and painted that along the inside of the rolling door, so you would basically have like the metal frame of that door visible around the perimeter of the door opening. And then next I came in and glued in all the window sills all around the layout, just using some CA to help glue all those in place. And then I used a small screwdriver to make sure those little wooden window sills were pushed as hard and tightly as they could be to the bottom of each of the windows. I then used some more CA to glue in the panels that had the interior of the windows and the doors to each side of the structure. And then before gluing on the front panels that have the front door and the loading door, I went ahead and painted the bottom of that loading door opening a yellow color to basically simulate the warning stripes that you would have there. And then while that was drying, I added some blue painter's tape around the perimeter of the structure and worked on painting the roof. Here I just used kind of a gray-green color and used that for the entire rooftop as well as the sill around the top of the structure itself. I tried to make sure I was only brushing up from the tape towards the top of the structure and not down towards the tape to help prevent any of the paint from getting pushed underneath the tape. So once I had the edges done, I just filled in the overall roof interior as well. And then I peeled off the tape before the paint dried so it wouldn't pull any of the dried paint off when I pulled the tape off. Then it was just a matter of gluing in the panels to the front of the structure, and all those interior parts were then installed and ready to go. I then broke out my weathering powders and applied a mixture of black and gray and brown weathering powders to all different areas of the structure to help make it look a little bit dirtier and more worn. The last step was just to install the window glazing, and he does give you plenty of material for that, and that also is very easy to install since he gives you a whole sheet for each side of the structure, so you don't have to worry about doing each individual window by themselves. You just glue on the whole sheet of plastic to each side of the structure, and everything is covered up, so you have plenty of space to apply adhesive well away from the actual window openings. To attach the window glazing, I did use my tester's adhesive for clear parts, and that worked really well for everything. So anyway, a cool addition, and now I can go ahead, get all these structures off the layout, and work on the track and scenery. Okay, so for the rail painting, what I'm using is this Mission Models Rail Tie Brown, and I've used different paints and things. I just want something that's kind of like that dark brown color that looks like rail and not bright, clean nickel silver track. And then I like to use Neolube for the turnout areas because Neolube is conductive. Now I have to be careful with it that you don't get it everywhere and short out stuff, but the whole frog section of the Kato Unitrack turnouts is one piece, and so you can go ahead and paint the Neolube on there and it'll turn it black like I did here, and that makes it look better, but it's also conductive, so it's not going to ruin the conductivity of this whole frog area. If you paint this, you have to make sure you keep the rail heads clean and all that, and it's just easier to use the Neolube because whether it's on the rail heads or not doesn't really matter because it's still going to be conductive. So I've already gotten this area here complete, including this cluster of turnouts here. And so I'm just going to work on this area here, show you how I'm doing everything, and we'll move on to the next step. So I'm basically just taking a paintbrush and putting it on the rails, not really being too careful. I get it on the roadbed because I am going to be coming back here and ballasting, and actually I don't think it looks that bad on the roadbed anyway. Yeah, because you have rust and everything else that gets onto the roadbed from underneath the rails anyway. Now, I'm only painting the sides of the rails that are facing the front of the layout. I don't really see any point in painting the backside because, I mean, you know, you're not going to get back here to look at it. It's just going to be really hard. Now, with the camera, like on a train, yeah, you'll see it, but it's really hard to paint back here this way, and, you know, I don't think it's just really worth the trouble. So if you can't see it, I'm not going to bother with it. I'm just really trying to work the paint into the bottoms, like the rail web area there. So now I'll come back with the Neolube. And if you haven't used this before, this is basically just graphite and alcohol. And so you end up getting a graphite layer left on whatever you put it. So it's actually a lubricant, which certainly can reduce traction, you know, for your trains. But, you know, you're not using this on the whole track. You're just using it on these frog areas. And I'll put it on the rail behind the point. Now before the paint dries, I'm just going to take an alcohol wipe and wipe down the rail heads. Alright, so now all of the rail is painted. Okay, so I painted part of the backdrop black. Those are the areas that are behind the windows of the structure, so if you look through the windows, you'll just see, you know, black back there, so it won't look like the wood wall. And so I just painted those areas black. And then the remainder of the backdrop, I'm going to paint this ethereal mood, a very light blue color, and just on the bottom portion for now. And I'll go ahead and get that paint on here. I don't need to be very careful around the structure areas here, so I need to overlap the black a little bit with the blue, but overall doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. I'll probably have to come back and do a second coat, I'm guessing, as well. And I masked off the areas I didn't want to get paint on. And I'll go ahead and cover up the track as well while I'm working so I don't get areas of paint on the track to have to clean off later on. And that doesn't look great yet, but I'll come back and add a second coat and get that looking nice and even once this first rough layer of paint dries. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and get these background structures glued in place because, you know, there's not going to be anything obviously behind them, so it'll be easier to do the scenery work with these structures installed and then kind of work my way forward getting scenery and structures installed as I go along. I'm just going to use a combination of some CA and some tacky glue here for this structure installation. I'll come back and do some additional touch-up probably as well with some CA, but just running a bead along the bottom. And this is all going to be covered up with scenery material as well when I ballast the track and everything. And to some extent, the scenery material is going to help hold this structure in place as well. but that'll dry clear. I'll come back probably, and if I need to fill in some gaps along the backdrop and that kind of thing, I can do that. When I do all the ballasting along here, all that glue and ballast will really anchor the structure in place, and that will be more than adequate to hold everything. For this structure here, I'll do some CA on part of it here, probably along this roof line. I'll do tacky glue on the bottom. Glue to the side here. And the last is my retaining wall piece that's going to go along here. I think I'll just use a whole bunch of tacky glue. I'll have to fill this back area in with some foam, and I probably should have put that in there first, but just want to get this glued down now. Just use these files to help prop it forward like it's supposed to be. Alright, I'll just let all this dry, then I can come back and start working on the track ballasting. I mixed up several colors of ballast. This was all fine ballast and even some dirt and soil material from Arizona Rock and Mineral to get a color and shade that I liked, and overall just kind of mixed everything together until I got something I was happy with. Now before I actually started applying the ballast, I took these removable glue dots and I stuck them all over the Kato turnouts. Anywhere there was an opening where I didn't want to get those ballast grains into, I covered up with a few of those glue dots to pretty much seal all of those openings. So that's where the levers are, where the actual points are, just anywhere that something could get lodged into and cause a problem. So once that was done, I worked on applying glue. When I ballast, I like to apply a layer of white glue to the area that I plan to ballast, so there's something on the very bottom of the ballast to help hold it in place. When you're just soaking ballast from the top, sometimes you don't get that glue to soak all the way to the bottom, so if you have glue on the bottom as well, that really helps to make sure that your entire ballast layer is going to be quite secure. So I just used a bottle to spread on some of the white glue and then a brush to get a nice even layer. Then I use a small cup to put on my first layer of ballast. I don't ever try to do ballast in one pass. It never works out that well if you try to do that, so I always plan on 2 or 3 passes with the ballast. So I just try to get a nice even coverage with that first pass of ballast, getting everything nice and smooth with the brush, not worrying about trying to get 100% coverage everywhere that I eventually will need it. I then sprayed everything down with some isopropyl alcohol as a wetting agent, but you could also just use some water with some detergent in it to soak into the ballast. And then I took a large bottle with diluted white glue and just dribbled that all over the areas I needed to glue the ballast down. Again, because I was planning on doing multiple coats, I didn't have to be too careful. Again, I did plan to come back and touch things up another time or two. I made sure everything was very thoroughly soaked, so there's actually probably more glue than I needed in a lot of places, but I wanted to make sure, since this was a portable layout, that I wouldn't have to worry about any of the ballast breaking free over time. I then came back the next day and removed all the glue dots and made sure that all the turnouts were operating properly, brushing any bits of ballast around the points to make sure there was no issues with getting those points to move back and forth on the turnout. And once I was happy that everything was still operating correctly, I moved on to working on the next layer of ballast. This next layer of ballast was a pretty thin coat since I did already have the bulk of the ballast in place. So just trying to get everything evened out, get better coverage on the track and that kind of thing. So just put a thin layer of ballast, spread everything out with the brush, and then I worked on adding ballast to the front part of the layout that I didn't do on the first pass. So once I had this layer of ballast applied everywhere, I again spread everything down with some IPA and then soaked everything with the diluted white glue. While that was drying, I worked on scenicking the back corner of the layout where the retaining wall was. I painted that area with a brownish color paint and then sprinkled on some ground foam. I did plan to come back later and add some shrubs and everything to this, but this for now at least got that first layer of ground foam adhered. So once again, I came back the next day after everything had dried with the ballast and worked on applying a third coat to most of the areas. And after applying that third thin layer of ballast, I went ahead and actually applied some ground foam between the track areas as well, so I could adhere that with the ballast all in one go here on this third pass. So again, same process, soaking everything with the alcohol and then dribbling on glue across the entire area. So the next day after that dried, it was time to come back and work on doing some static grass. Okay, at this point I'm happy with all the ballasting, and so I'm going to move on to doing some static grass. So in my Static King grass applicator, I have just a various mix of different colors of green. There's some lighter colors in there too, but it's mostly just various shades of green. It's various brands as well, so not any particular kind. I just kind of mix stuff to get a color that I liked. And so all I'm going to do is apply some diluted glue in all the areas where I want to have the grass, and then kind of stipple it in there with a brush to work it in those areas. And then I can run the static grass applicator over it, and that will only stick to the areas that have the glue, and then I can remove the excess. So this is just my regular diluted white glue, and I'm just going to run a bead through the middle here. I might actually come back and work in some full strength glue as well. I don't want really sharp edges to the glue, so I want to kind of just work it in there. I do want to get a little bit along the buildings as well, so I'm just going to dab some full strength glue along there with a smaller brush. Okay, I'll get some of this loose stuff off right away with a clean vacuum. That is, I mean, the only thing in here will be the grass, so I can recover it. So even though I just put this on a second ago, you can see running the vacuum over it, the static grass does stick pretty well to where the glue is, and gets pulled off from all the areas that doesn't have it, so you can see right away how things are going to be. And I think that's fine the way it is right now. There's some variation in the edges. I think that looks good. You know, I can come back and do little bits of ground foam and things like that to represent weeds and shrubs as well. So I could have done more yellowish colors in there, I suppose, but I think it's fine. And so I'll just kind of keep on moving and doing some other areas here and get all this done. Then I can let this dry and come back and do, you know, the next layer of scenery work on top of it. Now I'm going to work on adding some of this Woodland Scenics light green clump foliage, as well as this fine leaf material, which I like a lot as well. The main thing I want to work on first is this area back here on top of the retaining wall. Just going to cover that in glue and just press a bunch of the material in there and then soak it with some diluted glue. And you know, I'll probably have to come back and do some additions later on as well. I think at this point it might be worthwhile to try to glue this building in place and get this area of scenery done. So anyway, you can kind of see what the scenery is going to be like with those structures and everything in place over there. This one over here, I have to apparently touch up the sky there. I'm going to go ahead and get this structure glued in place and do the scenery around it. Just using some tacky glue and some CA here along the front edge. Get that pressed in there. Add some weights, make sure it doesn't move. All right, now I'll let all this sit for now and come back and do some additional work, but definitely getting very close. So now that everything is about done, one thing I want to do is take some of my pan pastel weathering powders and apply those to the track area to kind of dirty it up and blend it in a little bit. You know, there's different color variations here. I can kind of use the darker shades of the powders to, you know, make it look just, there's more oil stains and just things, grease stains, things like that, and give it just an overall darker, dirtier look, which I think will look a little bit better overall. I'll go ahead and just, again, use a couple browns and a black, or dark gray, I guess, and work on that just with a large paintbrush. So you can kind of see the comparison here between the track that I've done and the track that I haven't done. So, you know, I think overall, it's not as much about making it look more realistic per se as kind of getting it out of the way so you're not seeing the things that aren't as close to scale and things like that. So in general, if you make the colors darker, it kind of hides imperfections. If you make the colors lighter, it makes them more obvious. So by dulling down and darkening up the track overall, I think it just makes it look a little bit better from a distance. So with the darker and the lighter brown, if I think it's too dark, I can use a lighter brown, lighten it up, and vice versa. Okay, so I have most of the buildings attached now. Those are glued down. I can take the weights off. The last structure to glue down is this one right here. Again, just using more tacky glue. I'm using it because there's a lot of different materials here and it just tends to stick to everything pretty well. Now the one thing here I have to be sure of is that I have the spacing correct so I can actually have boxcars clear both sides and not hit the structure. And since the layout was nearly complete, it was time to add some polyurethane to the entire exterior and interior of the wooden parts of the layout. And so I just used a satin polyurethane and ended up applying 2 to 3 coats across most of the actual layout itself, doing a light sanding in between each coat, but that always makes everything look a lot better. I then removed the folding legs for this layout since I didn't really like them that much. While they were nice to use to help elevate the layout, they just basically scratched anything you put them on because they were metal and had a lot of sharp edges. So I decided to just take off those folding legs since I usually just ended up having this layout on top of a table or counter anyway when I operated it. And so I just screwed on some small rubber feet. And so with these rubber feet screwed onto both the back and the bottom of the layout, I can either set it on its back or on the bottom on whatever surface I have it on, and it's not going to scratch any of those surfaces. So finally it was time to add the layout details. One of the first things I did here was to add some parking spaces between the structures at the front of the layout. This kit here gives you laser cut wooden bumpers for parking spaces and gives you a template for drawing the lines for each of the parking spaces. So I used a Woodland Scenics white road striping pen to draw all the markings for each of the parking spaces. And then I also used a template initially for proper placement of the bumper at the front of each parking space, but that really just proved to be too hard to do, so I eventually just manually placed each of those bumpers by hand. I also added some trash bins in different areas, put in a couple of non-operating lights for the parking area, glued in some cars in various locations as well, put in a railroad crossing sign on one side, and then I worked on adding a Woodland Scenics chain link fence to separate the concrete pad area between the 2 warehouse kits and the structure on the far right hand side. These fences are easy to install since they're pre-assembled, so it's just a matter of poking some holes through the road base area for the posts of the fence, and then I just use CA to glue everything in place. I did some more parking spots on that side of the structure as well, added in again a few more dumpsters and more vehicles to those areas. And then I ran some CA along the fence on both sides and just added some earth ground foam to both sides of that fence to kind of imply that there were weeds and other things growing right along the fence line. I also glued on a few containers since you often see those in a lot of places around various industrial structures just for extra storage and that kind of thing. And then it was time to work on making a Velcro track plan for the top lid of the layout. I decided that I wanted to add some Velcro here so that I could have Velcro on the back of all of my car cards, and then I could place the car cards on the Velcro track plan where I intended to switch each of the cars to make it very, very easy to just glance up at the track plan and then glance down at the layout to figure out where all the car movements needed to happen. So I basically just cut each of these Velcro pieces to shape and then just try to get the track plan as close as possible. But anyway, with that, this layout was complete, at least to the point that I was trying to get it to at this point in time. Again, there's always additional details or signs or different things like that you can come back and add, but for now, this layout is at a more or less completed state. Anyway, it took me a long time to finally get this layout complete. I spent a couple years working on it on and off, but I'm really happy with how this layout turned out. I hope you enjoyed the whole journey as I built this layout over the past couple of years, and overall I really like how everything turned out in the end. So anyway, I'll just leave you here with some final scenes of this layout, and thank you very much for watching. Bye.